So I actually didn't even sleep last night because I was working on this podcast and Sacco and Vanzetti was 45 minutes and I couldn't get my um, what I wanted to say about Joe Colombo. I couldn't express the proper words, and so I kept re-recording myself, and then I ended up passing out. I don't even know what time it was, but and I slept for a couple of hours. But the story that I'm going to tell you about Joe Colombo is probably my perspective of it is different than other people's perspective, and that's always my goal, is to give you another side of a story with some things, but also maybe to give you food for thought in regards to how you view different things and offer a different perspective of things. Because in Joe Colombo's case, I don't think that people really look at what he did in a positive light. In fact, I know that that's true because when I was doing research, there really wasn't, other than one place in the small little blurb in this overall article, where he was actually credited for the accomplishments that he made with the Italian American Civil Rights League. And this isn't going to be a bio on Joe Colombo, mob boss. You want to read that, you can go to the New York Mafia, and my colleague wrote an extensive bio on him. This is going to be about Joe Colombo, founder of the Italian American Civil Rights League. And my view of this is that what he did was almost revolutionary because it had never been done before. And a lot of the things that he said at the time were really visionary because not only were they relevant to the situation, they were relevant to even today, just like Sacco and Vanzetti, which is why I kind of tied these two together because of the relevancy to situations that are happening today. And when I do these promos of different things, and I use a lot of quotes to try to tell the story, and a lot of times I'll put two quotes in front of things related to Joe Colombo, and it's relevant, and I do that for a reason. And this particular quote relates to the story I'm going to tell you. Is when you believe in something, fight for it, and when you see injustice, fight harder than you have ever fought before. That's one quote that is it was by Brad Meltzer that I think is relative to Joe Colombo and what he did with the Italian American Civil Rights League. And then the other one is stand up for what you believe in, even if it causes waves. And that's a quote by Catherine Buddig. And both of them relate to, like I said, what Joe Colombo did with the Italian American Civil Rights League. So I'm going to get into that. I'm going to tell you why that is. And then I'm going to get into my different perspective of Joe Colombo. And it might actually be something, a radical thing, because nobody will ever take a different stand on things. And they always want to have these negative connotations about different things. And Joe Colombo was not given proper credit for what he did, like I said, and I think that he deserves recognition for his accomplishments, and that's what I'm going to speak about. And I'm actually going to start with a quote by Joe Colombo's son, Anthony. He had written a book that was published in 2013 called Colombo Unsolved, The Unsolved Murder. And I will speak of that actually a little bit later. But in 2016, he did an interview with Ed Scarpo, who I found this on Medium, but I think it's the same Ed Scarpo that's affiliated with Cosa Nostra News. But I thought that this quote was very relevant, and it fits in with actually my thinking about Joe Colombo and the Italian American Civil Rights League. So the interviewer had asked this question: what do you want the world to know today about your father? And Anthony Colombo answered and said this: my father was a great man. He fought for not only Italian Americans, he fought for the underdog. He served our country honorably in World War II. He was the founder of the Italian American Civil Rights League, a grassroots political movement that sought to help everyone fight police and governmental abuse. He and he alone was bold enough to stand up to the FBI. No one before and no one since has directly challenged their abusive tactics, their clandestine domestic spying, and their willingness to thwart the very law they purportedly sought to uphold. With only a year period, my father changed the face of New York politics and was poised to change the face of American politics. I'd like his accomplishments to be recognized. And if I could put into words what I want to say, that's probably a good summary of how I feel as well. And people, when it comes to the Italian American Civil Rights League, will only focus on the negative aspects of it, and will always, and you can't not associate the fact that he was a mob boss, but that's the only portion of it that people will focus on instead of taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. Because if he didn't have that label attached to him, would people focus on the negative things, or would they look at it as how it should be looked at, that it was almost revolutionary and the things that he said were visionary? And especially if you take his words and think of them in today's environment with what is happening with a variety of things. And so that's really the stance that I'm going to take with this, and I think that it's something different. When Joe Colombo took over as boss of the Colombo family, and I'm not, like I said, not going to focus on all of this historical mob boss stuff, but it's relevant at least to how everything began. And when he became boss of the Colombo family, it was there was a lot of scrutiny by the FBI and law enforcement, which, is to be expected. And when the FBI deals with organized crime, they will pull out their down and dirty playbook. And I've spoken of this many, many times. They just don't follow the rules, and they make up rules as they go along. And Anthony Colombo actually speaks of this, which I will share a little bit later, about the tactics that are used when they have a specific target in mind. And Joe Colombo and the Colombo family were a target. So sometimes the FBI will harass not only their target, but everybody associated with that target. And Joe Colombo's son, Joe Colombo Jr., had gotten arrested and charged with melting down coins to ingots, I don't know if I pronounced that right. And when that happened, Joe Colombo felt that it was an affront to his family and that the FBI had overstepped their bounds. And Joe Colombo Jr. had actually gotten acquitted the following year, I think, because, there are conflicting stories about that. And one story says it was because the witness against him was arrested for perjury, and another story says that the guy mysteriously forgot what it was that he was going to say. And of course, everybody wants to latch on to the negative part of it rather than, maybe the FBI overstepped their bounds and went after Joe Colombo's kid because they were trying to do things to coerce him to do something to implicate himself so that they could arrest him and then prosecute him and so forth. And Joe Colombo did do something, but not what it is that they probably expected. And this is actually in Anthony Colombo's book. He had given a little bit of a description of how when Joe Colombo Jr. was arrested and how that all happened with what the FBI did. They broke down his door and harassed his wife and things like that. And when Joe Colombo Sr. heard about that, it pissed him off so much that he gathered a group of family and friends and marched down to FBI headquarters to start protesting. If you look at that just from the perspective of a father protecting his kid, that's admirable, because I think that any of us who are parents would do whatever was necessary to protect our kids. And the fact that he actually went up against the bullies, because if you look at it that way, the FBI really was and probably still are bullies when it comes to this. It was pretty damn ballsy of him to actually do that, and it was something that nobody ever would expect that anyone would do in his position, which why he's visionary, because visionary people, I found this on the internet, is a visionary leader is breaking away from what's expected. And that's exactly what he did when he marched down to the FBI headquarters and started protesting. And I can't even imagine what it is they thought at the time when a bunch of people who, some of them were affiliated with organized crime, were chanting in front of their building, "Heidi, Heidi, Heidi ho, the FBI has got to go." And if you think about that, it's actually kind of funny that that was happening. And of course, you know, the FBI wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. You know, they wanted to ignore it, and they couldn't. And Anthony Colombo actually said that at one point, members of the FBI were going up to the roof and pelting protesters with eggs and ice, which actually is kind of childish thing to do. And then as it went on, because the protests actually lasted from April through June, before the first Unity Day rally, they started getting a little bit more aggressive with things because they couldn't ignore what was happening, because it was all over the news, and it was a narrative that they couldn't change, although they did change it because, of course, they turned it into this Mafia related thing, and that's how they tried to discredit Joe Colombo with this organization and the actions that he was taking. And the Italian American Civil Rights League wasn't formed at the same time that he was protesting. I mean, it did happen when he was protesting the FBI, but he actually formed it, I'm not sure exactly how soon after his son was arrested, but he had gone to different organizations to try and seek some relief as an Italian American, because he did feel that he was being persecuted and that his family was being persecuted by the government, the big bad government, against him for something that he didn't feel, you know, that they were that he felt that they weren't playing fair. So when he was rejected by all of these different organizations who didn't want to affiliate with or step into the ring of alleged organized crime, he decided to form his own organization to stand up not only for him and his sons, but for all of Italian Americans. And it was revolutionary in that so many people latched onto it that weren't affiliated with organized crime, because they finally realized that somebody had stepped up and spoken out, and they latched onto it because they were silent and wanted to have a voice, and Joe Colombo opened up that door for them. And it was something that obviously the FBI was incensed about, and they did a lot of things during that whole protest that was happening in front of their building to stop what was happening, but do it in a surreptitious way. And so they got different ordinances and stuff like that, that what they were doing was disrupting neighbors. And then they got orders that made the protesters couldn't chant, they couldn't use microphones, and that's how they were trying to squash this movement. But by that time, Joe Colombo was doing different interviews, and he was getting attention. So in these interviews, and this is how they tried to change their narrative and turn it into a negative aspect, was the media asked Joe Colombo, well, you know, are you a member of the Mafia? Are you a mob boss? And of course, he's going to say no to everything and say, well, the mafia doesn't exist and I'm just a businessman. Because if you look at it in a different way, whatever he said wasn't going to be the right thing to say. If he didn't say anything and stayed silent, they would say, well, obviously that shows that he's exactly what we think he is. And instead, he denied it, and he was attacked for that too. And it's because no matter what it is that he would have said, it would have been turned into something negative. And it was turned into something negative. But you have to think, well, that's what he's going to say because that's what he should say. He's not, like I said, he's not going to admit any of that. So what he accomplished with the Italian American Civil Rights League was actually astounding. And what he accomplished with the Italian American Civil Rights League was done in a relatively short amount of time because really the league only existed for a year when he started it in April 1970 until his assassination that following June 1971. And I think the organization lasted a little while after he was killed, but everything that he accomplished, which was significant, happened before his assassination. And I'm not really sure of the time frame, if it was done before, all of this was done before the first Unity Day rally, but he accomplished enough that the movement took off. And he did this because really he wanted to fight Italian stereotypes, and that is what people latched onto. And so the Godfather movie was being filmed, or it was about to be filmed, and this is actually the most famous one. He had convinced Francis Ford Coppola to remove the word mafia from use in that film, and supposedly Francis Ford Coppola had to rewrite the script. And he also convinced Coppola to hire Italian American actors to play the different roles in the movie. He also convinced Macy's to stop selling the Godfather game, which was put together obviously, after the movie. And in addition, he convinced Ford Motor Company, who was the sponsor of this, ironically, TV show called FBI, he convinced them to get rid of the way that they were stereotyping Italians, that all Italians were gangsters. And so Leah Iacocca, who was head of Ford, agreed to do that, which, think about that, how incredibly ironic that is that he was able to make that happen. The famous Alka-Seltzer commercial where the guy is sitting at a table and he's eating spaghetti and he says, "Mamma mia, that's a spicy meatball." He was able to get that pulled off the air because it was derogatory to Italian people. And probably the one accomplishment that I think was the most astounding was that he convinced the government to drop mafia, the terms mafia and la Cosa Nostra, in their indictments and other official documents. And of course, that it's not a thing that happens anymore. They write a whole 2 pages worth of descriptions of what, the mafia and la Cosa Nostra represent. But at that time, he was able to get those terms removed from any judicial type documents, which is astounding. And the Attorney General at the time, John Mitchell, said in regards to that, "There is nothing to be gained by using these terms except to give gratuitous offense to many good Americans of Italian American descent." Because it was creating a stereotype that if you're Italian, then you must be related to the mafia. And even, I think today, that's still a perception that a lot of people have. And my colleague at the New York Mafia wrote in his bio for the website, actually wrote about that, and you might want to go to the site under the About section and read what he has to say about being an Italian American and how it was growing up in and that kind of thing. But with those terms in relation to judicial documents, even the state police was ordered by the governor of New York to amend their vocabulary not to use those different terms. And I think that that is really significant that the FBI, because Justice Department and the FBI are related, to have acquiesced to that demand, even if it didn't last as long as it should have. Because really, if you think about it, in those indictments, it's already pinpointing and tainting potential jury pool when they send out their press release, include the indictment along with that, in addition to everything else that they do with their press releases, which I've talked about previously. And so at that first Unity Day rally, they had a lot of different speakers, and I want to talk a little bit about that and what people said at that time, which I think is very relevant as well and very true if you take a step back and look at what it is that was said at that time. Representative Mario Biaggi of New York spoke at that first Unity Day rally, and he had said that, 22 million Americans are of Italian American descent, and only about 5,000 of them were supposedly organized crime related. And so when all of these different things were happening with stereotypes, they were taking this whole group of 22 million people and stereotyping them as all gangsters, which I just spoke about. And that's actually quite relative or relevant to what's going on today if you take a look at all of the headlines. But anyway, so this Mario Biaggi said in his speech, without a doubt, the FBI and its director, J. Edgar Hoover, deserve the respect of us all. Let us not fall into the trap of employing for our own use that which we condemn because of the misconduct of a few. Let us not use a wide black brush on the FBI, and let not the FBI or any other law enforcement agency use the same brush on us. So if you dissect that statement, what he says is true, because not every member of the FBI or Justice Department are, have ulterior motives or, are engaging in misconduct. So if these people are willing to not paint a brush against all members of the FBI and Justice Department, why shouldn't the same be said for the FBI and the Justice Department and everybody else not to use a brush to paint a stereotype over all of them? And if you take that just one step further, the government will not only paint people a certain way, but even when they put out their indictments and their press releases today, they will use that brush to paint people a certain way and taint, I say this all the time, but taint that jury pool, because they take their evidence that they're going to use in trial and throw some of it out to the public to say, hey, look at all of this. And so that creates a lot of issues which relates to all of this in regards to the kind of harassment, I guess you could call it, and how it affects, the families of these people that they're claiming are this, that, and the other thing. And it's not really fair. So if Italian Americans can take the stance of, look, we're not going to paint you like this, why are you painting us like this? It goes, even if it was said back in 1970, you push forward and you can still apply it to today. Why is that being done? And also at that rally, there was a 12-year-old boy by the name of Anthony LaRosa who also spoke, and he said this, which I thought was really interesting as well. I am a young Italian American boy who doesn't want to grow up labeled. I want to grow up with my constitutional rights, not to be harassed and discriminated against. And that says a lot too, that this 12-year-old child sees things as they are. And if you take apart his statement, what he says is actually correct, in that no matter who you are, you have constitutional rights that you deserve, and these rights should be followed, and things should be fair and just, and labels shouldn't be thrown around because the government has a specific target in mind and will do whatever is necessary to bring that target to their skewed view of justice. And that's not how any of it is supposed to work. And so all of this goes back to what Joe Colombo was doing, even if it was mafia, quote unquote, mafia related because of who he was. What he's saying is 100% true. And I think that that's all he really wanted, was for the government to play fair, and they didn't. And they still don't play fair with anything that they do in relation to, these men. And it's unfortunate because it shouldn't be happening that way. And even is, if you look back at what I said about Sacco and Vanzetti, it all ties together because they were labeled as anarchists and immigrants, and they were immigrants and anarchists, but they took those labels and applied them to when they went to trial. And of course, the judge who presided over that trial had all of these biases against Italians and immigrants and anarchists, and used that against these men when he was supposed to be before a fair and impartial judge, and was supposed to have a fair and impartial trial, and that just didn't happen. And so you take that and you take this, and it's all connected because it still happens today, and people aren't given their constitutional rights. And for a 12-year-old child to recognize that, I think is something that it should be thought about. People should think about that. How it should be considered when you think about the entire situation and things that happen. And again, I will go back to what my colleague wrote in his bio. He explains a lot of that, what happens. And it's not people making stuff up, it's things that really, really happen. So I think that needs to be considered when you take a step back and look at how all of this operates then and how it all operates now, and maybe at least consider revising your thought process regarding all of this. And in that same vein, the law of the land is that you're innocent until proven guilty, and it's expected that you will do things in an ethical way. And I think that's also what Joe Colombo was addressing with everything that he was doing, because in a 1970 New York Times article, he said, if I do something, then I deserve to pay the penalty, but the FBI shouldn't harass my children and relatives because of what I do. And of course, that was related to what happened with his son, Joe Colombo Jr., but he's absolutely right in that as well, because everything is related. And I spoke about this already, how the family of these people are affected, and that goes back to when the government releases their indictments and releases their press releases to the media, and the media picks it all up, and all of that, again, it taints the jury, and it causes issues with family or with friends and neighbors. And if there are kids involved, then they're going to be affected by that as well. And nothing has been proven, even been proven in court, but the government will take this information and use it to create a certain narrative, and it's not playing fair. And that's really what I think Joe Colombo was talking about when he started all of this, and the different things that he said. And he actually did give another interview, or he actually wrote an article in 1971 before he was killed. It actually was published the day he was killed in Westchester newspaper, and it was republished in an Elmira, New York newspaper. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but what he said in that article, because when after he formed this organization, a lot of different other organizations that stand up for rights joined in his fight for what he was trying to do, and that included the NAACP and the Jewish Defense League. And his name was Meir Kahane, and he was leader of the Jewish Defense League. And so when that happened, that's when Joe Colombo wrote this article. And I think that Kahane also wrote something as well about why they came together. And in that article, this is what Joe Colombo said in regards to the Italian American Civil Rights League. And there are two sections, and I'm gonna quote both of them. He said, "We want our people to be free, free of discrimination, defamation, guilt by association, guilt by innuendo. No matter what the ethnic background, we all belong here in the United States. This is our country belonging to all ethnic groups." So if you dissect that, what he's saying, and again, it goes back to the whole idea that he was visionary, because it applies to things that are happening today. And he's right when he is saying that defamation, because when the different stereotypes come out with, Alka-Seltzer and that type of stuff, and also press releases by the government, that falls into defamation, guilt by association, and guilt by innuendo, because they're not being given a fair shake. And that really, again, was his whole point of everything, is that just play fair. Why can't you just play fair? Why do you have to do these things that are not fair and just, and you want to cheat? It's cheating. It's really, really cheating. And actually, Anthony Colombo talks in his book about harassment and stuff like that, and I am going to get to, because there are some things that he says in his book that are really, really interesting that I want to share with you. But I still want to talk about Joe Colombo, that article in the New York Times, because this is also really, really significant and ties into what I had just talked about. He said, "Also, to sell a newspaper, we don't feel they should create slander and dirt. The news media should be clean, good, constructive, and show two sides of every story." So think about that. He recognizes what it is that the government is doing when they are targeting people, and he's also he's making a statement about that, because it all does tie together when the FBI or the Justice Department sends out the press releases and the news media picks it up, and they only print what the government provides them without taking a step back and considering if what it is that is being put out by the government is true, and also the media is not considering the fact that those little pieces of juicy evidence, they're not thinking that maybe that's going to bias people against these men that are being accused, because it goes back once again to you're innocent until proven guilty. But all of these pieces of evidence that the government likes to throw out with their indictments really paints a certain picture, which goes back to the quote that was said at that first Unity Day rally. So with all of this, you need to just take a step back and say, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. And you need to separate all of these labels from Joe Colombo in regards to this, because what he says is absolutely true. And if he's thinking that, and even though he's out front and center, which he probably shouldn't have been doing, what does that say about everybody else who is in the same situation that he is? And his vision and his goals for this are absolutely 100% admirable, because he's speaking for so many people. But the fact that he was the one that was front and center of this whole movement was not, he probably wasn't the person to have been doing that. And maybe he felt that he was the only one who was able to get the message across. I'm not sure I quite believe all of the things that have been printed about that he just enjoyed the limelight so much and that's why he couldn't step back. I mean, who's saying that? Is it, it's people who are already biased about certain things, so, of course they don't want to recognize the successfulness of this organization, so they want to try to use that brush to paint all of this into a negative light, even if he probably shouldn't have been the one who was front and center. In that article I mentioned that he wrote was actually from, I think I said it was from the New York Times. It was from an Elmira, New York newspaper that republished it on July 5th, 1971, after he was killed. But it's, and if you go to the hidden Joe Colombo section, which I'm going to move to its own navigation label, you can find it there and read the whole thing, because I think it's really worth reading. So, but to go back to the whole news media thing, and everything that he said in general, I think was very, very valid. And once again, it's people wanting to paint a certain picture and not give him the credit that he deserves and just associate it with his label. And that goes back to actually some things that Anthony Colombo wrote in his book, because if you really look at this objectively and you take a step back, what Joe Colombo accomplished with the Italian American Civil Rights League wasn't expected, and perhaps even put the FBI in a bad light because it exposed all of their shady tactics that they use, and of course they don't want that to be exposed, and so maybe that contributed to why he was killed. And that's just not me, just talking off the top of my head. There are like several theories about why Joe Colombo was killed, and Anthony Colombo actually talks about it in his book. And the most popular theory is that it was Joe Gallo who did it, or that Carlo Gambino ordered it. But in Anthony Colombo's book, he does not believe any of that, which I think is what is the most interesting thing of all of this. He believes that the FBI was behind it. In his book, in the preface, he says the account of his death is a myth perpetuated by the FBI and the media. And so at the end of his book, he actually talks about all of these different theories. And I didn't actually read the entire book because I'm still reading this $51 Joseph Barboza book. And I think I'm going to switch to this because it really interests me more. Not that I'm not interested in Barboza anymore, because I really am. It's just that book is a particularly difficult book to read. But in his book, he presents different theories. One is the lone gunman theory, because the guy who actually did the shooting. The other one is the BART theory, which is the Black Revolutionary Attack Team, which apparently this organization sent a letter to the Associated Press claiming that they were behind Joe Colombo's murder. Then, of course, there's the Gallo theory, and then the Gambino theory, and then the FBI and CIA theory. So I think it's worth at least going and reading the book to see what he has to say about all of that. But the fact that he believes that it was the FBI behind that, in association with the media, because the media will report everything that is fed to them, the mass media, that says a lot to the theory that maybe the FBI wasn't too happy about what Joe Colombo was doing, and it would be they could manipulate the story, manipulate the narrative that all of these other people were involved in it because they were unhappy that Joe Colombo was out front and center when, the the legend of the mafia is that they're supposed to stay in the shadows. And that probably was true. I'm not saying that wasn't true. I'm sure it shocked a lot of people that he was out there knowing who he was. Everybody knew who he was, and he was, front and center like that. But it seems reasonable that the theory that the FBI and the CIA, I would go with the FBI, was behind it is a reasonable theory just for the fact that he just this movement took off, and they obviously didn't expect that that was going to happen. So what's the best way to get rid of the problem? It's not like they've never done it before. They do it all the time with a whole lot of different things that sometimes you know about and sometimes you don't know about, and nobody's ever going to know. It's one of those mysteries of the universe that may never be solved. And you can look at other aspects of that, with Kennedy's assassination and stuff like that, and other types of things, as I said, that are talked about or people don't know about. And so it's something at least to consider, because once again, and I sound like a broken record, he was visionary in everything that he did, and it was what he accomplished was revolutionary, and nothing that is printed other than Anthony Colombo's book. And of course, that's his father. He's talking about his father. He's going to paint him in the best light. You have to consider that, but you can't just dismiss it because that's his son writing about his father. But all of the media in relation to this is still tainted negatively, and I don't really think that that's a fair assessment, because again, if you take away that label of mob boss and organized crime and looked at it from that perspective, you would say, hey, what this guy did was really astounding. And that's really how it should be looked at, because it was astounding. You also have to wonder what Joe Colombo would have thought of today, and also if he wouldn't have been assassinated, how, if things would be different, if all of the things he had accomplished with indictments and stuff like that, and the use of the term mafia and La Cosa Nostra, if that would still be in effect today, despite everything that happened in the 1980s with the commission trial and all of that. You have to wonder how things might have turned out differently. I just think the whole thing is really, really, really fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading that book. And I'm probably going to have a lot of other things to say about Joe Colombo, because he is still, I think, one of the most fascinating people for what it is that he did. And I have to go back to them in front of the FBI building chanting Heidi, Heidi, Heidi ho, the FBI has got to go. And that really had to get under their skin, and maybe they started plotting something way back then. And as everybody knows, Joe Colombo was killed at the second Unity Day rally in 1971, and it was in the morning. There weren't a lot of people because they were expecting thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and there was chaos and all of that. And he was shot 3 times, and he stayed in a coma for 7 years before he died of complications related to that particular shooting. And it's really an unfortunate situation, like I said, because you have to wonder what everything would be like now and how much more he might have accomplished had he not been killed. And so one other thing that I want to mention from Anthony Colombo's book is he said 2 things. He said that the majority of intelligence, and this really isn't related to the Italian American Civil Rights League, this is just something random, but I wanted to bring it up because eventually I'm going to talk about informants, and very, very soon actually. And so I want to bring this up because I thought it was kind of amusing. He said that the majority of intelligence the FBI gathered about his father came from Gregory Scarpa Sr. And then what he said, and this is a direct quote, he said this about Gregory Scarpa Sr. And so I'm going to bring this up again when I talk about informants. So keep this in mind. He said, in regards to Scarpa, he was a relatively forgettable guy, which made him an ideal informant. So just think about that for a little bit in regards to informants, besides the fact that they're paid, which actually Anthony Colombo talks about that as well. But why is it that they're doing what they're doing? And it makes sense that they don't have a life, and they're an ideal informant. So being an informant not only gives you money and benefits at taxpayers' expense, and you are allowed to get away with your crimes because they forgive everything. We all know that. We could go down a whole list of people, and people who are on podcasts and people who have TV shows and on and on and on and on, but I'm not going to get into that. But what way to make yourself non-forgettable than to become an informant and skirt past your crimes, and there you go. So I thought it was interesting that Anthony Colombo actually had something to say about that. And again, he's obviously Joe Colombo's son. He's going to have something to say about that. However, what he's saying is true. It's not like these people are just biased. I mean, obviously they have a personal relationship with it all, but it's still valid what they're saying, because the whole informant situation is insane. And I'm not going to talk about that right now, because I will talk about that. But also, actually, and I'm looking at my notes here, what he also said was all roads leading to Joe Colombo were paved by FBI's paid informants and spreading rumors and newspapers printing stories without evidence. So I didn't even read his book, and I thought these same things, which I think is kind of ironic, because then when I read them, I'm like, that's what I've been saying all along. So I think that all of that is really interesting, and he also talks about his personal experience with FBI harassment and goes into some detail about that, which I also think is interesting for people to read, because it gives you a different perspective that isn't always out there, because people don't realize what's going on behind the scenes. And you actually have to give Anthony Colombo credit for putting this book out there, because families that may or may not be involved usually aren't going to speak out about anything, because it's just going to cause them more problems. So you have to give him credit for that. And again, I think that Joe Colombo should be looked at differently. I think that he should be recognized for his accomplishments with the Italian American Civil Rights League, and he should be given credit for what it is that he did with that. And whether he was front and center, I still don't believe that, that was he. I mean, everybody's going to enjoy attention, and maybe he did, but I don't agree with how all of this in relation to what he accomplished is painted in a negative light, and you can't find any alternative ideas or alternative theories or alternative reports about the positive side of things. And I think that that's really important. He said it himself, there are two sides to every story. So that's what I have on Joe Colombo, and I know that there's a lot of things actually I could go down rabbit holes, but I'm not. I'll probably refer back to Joe Colombo at some point, but right now I hope that you enjoyed all of my thoughts on Joe Colombo, and I will see you next time.